Good evening, everybody. Welcome to session 5 of our Lent course looking at the book of Revelation. Thank you for your very kind comments there about Sophie's pictures. I'll pass that on to her. She does like the encouragement and she's loving doing these drawings. We are working our way through the book of Revelation and we've got pretty far. This is session 5. After tonight, there's only 2 to go. We are almost at Maundy Thursday and our last session that we're going to be doing. What you've got tonight is you've got 30 minutes coming up here live on Facebook. We're going to be looking at chapters 12 and 14. Then around 8 p.m. we'll head over to Zoom to discuss all of that. We've had some great discussion in recent weeks. In previous weeks we've looked at big themes in Revelation like heaven and church and persecution and trouble. But today in John's vision we move away from those themes and instead we're looking at the characters involved in this apocalyptic vision. What I love about Revelation and why I wanted to share this with you is that it's not just a vision of some future thousands of years ahead which is so abstract from today, but it's actually talking about important issues that we see in the world today. It calls us to action, it calls us to social justice, it calls us to a vision of the world that's maybe different from what we see without the Bible. I want us to just crack straight on with it tonight. I think we'll have a look now at some of these characters that I'm talking about tonight. We're going to read now about a woman, her child, and the dragon. This is from chapter 12. Hello to everybody joining us at the moment. Thank you for saying hello, so I know that you're all there. That's great to see. Let's take a look at chapter 12, shall we? So I'm going to read from chapter 12 and I'm beginning at verse 1. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Okay, let's take a little look at this story about these 3 characters here. Verse 9, which we're about to look at, tells us who the dragon is. It tells us that this is Satan, the personification of evil. We aren't told who the woman and child symbolize. So let's take a look at it. Let's have a think about the woman first. Now, the most straightforward translation, and certainly the way that most Roman Catholics see it, is that the woman represents Mary. But many Protestants have identified the woman more symbolically as representing Israel, or sometimes even the church. And although this may just be because they don't like the esteem that the Roman Catholics hold Mary in, there may be something to it. The reason that this woman could symbolize Israel is because she's wearing a crown of 12 stars, which could symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel. And in a way, Israel kind of gave birth to the Messiah, so it does work. We're going to come back to that in a moment and think about the child too. But first, as we often get in Revelation, we get a little interlude in this dragon woman child story. And I'm going to read that to you right now. So this is again from chapter 12, and it's starting at verse 7 now. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short. Now, I find this story really quite interesting. This kind of fairy tale type story we get here. I find it interesting, and it's really useful to look at the truths that are revealed within it. We get this story about how the dragon and company, Satan and other angelic spirits, had a place in heaven. But at one point they rebelled. An angelic war broke out. The archangel Michael and his troops won that battle, and the devil was thrown to earth. And if you think that story sounds weird, then I can give you an even weirder one which I came across recently. There's an ancient story in the church that says that this battle all took place at Michaelmas, which is September the 29th. And when he was thrown to the earth, apparently the devil landed in a blackberry bush, according to this legend. And he was so angry that he urinated on the bush. And apparently that's why if you pick and eat blackberries after the end of September, they won't taste very good. It's an interesting story. You don't just get biblical teaching from me here, you also get vital public health info. Don't go eating blackberries in October, people. But this isn't the only place we hear about Satan's fall from heaven in these terms in the Bible. The devil's place in heaven is alluded to in Job too. But why? When we think about it, it's a bit strange, isn't it? Why would God allow evil to exist in heaven, in a place of pure love? Well, maybe because of free will. Maybe if we can think that God has created physical beings like us and given us free will, maybe we can also accept that he's made non-physical beings like angels and would give them free will too. Now, maybe angels have been given free will and they can worship God, but they can choose not to. But there are consequences for them turning their back on God, just like there are consequences for us. And that's the key thing to note here. Evil wreaks all kinds of havoc in this book of Revelation, but it's important to note that it has no future. There will only be a future for love. Verse 12 says that the devil knows his time is short. Let's move away from this interlude, shall we? Let's move back to the dragon, woman and child story. Okay, so I'm going to go to verse 13 of chapter 12 to resume the story. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she will be taken care of for a time, times and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Okay, so We know that the dragon is Satan because Revelation specifically tells us that. We aren't told who the woman and the child symbolises, but we've said that the woman is either Mary or Israel or the church. Most people think that the child represents Jesus, who was either born out of Israel or Mary, depending on your viewpoint. But there is a minority viewpoint amongst scholars that the child represents God's people, or Christians, born out of the mother who represents the church. And whilst this is a minority viewpoint, it does make some sense in a way, because if this child represents Jesus, then maybe in this story we would have expected the story to revolve around him more. And in reality, this story is really more about the dragon and the woman than it is about the child. Also, we know from previous weeks, I've really been labouring the point that Revelation is written to the persecuted church. And evil has tried to devour disciples and the church throughout time. Before the interlude that we had, we read that 1,260 days was the number used symbolically to represent a long time of persecution. 1,260 days is 42 months or 3.5 years. And a year in Revelation and in literature like it is sometimes called time. So after the interlude, we hear that this persecution lasts for times and half a time, 1 year, 2 years, and half a year, 3.5 years. Just want to give you a moment to think at the moment, because I've given different options for who these three characters represent. Who do you think these three symbolises? You can maybe use the chat function if you'd like, or just have a think about it, because I'm not sure that it matters who these three characters represent. I think it's absolutely fine for you to have your own views as to those that I've put out there. They could be the church and the saints, Christians. They could be Mary and Jesus, or Israel and Jesus. Maybe it's okay to think any of those. All of them are fairly pivotal to the biblical story, aren't they? Have a think, see what you think, and maybe bring your ideas to the discussion on Zoom later. Just pause a second, just in case anybody wanted to comment or in case there's any questions. Ron's asked I don't know whether it's a statement or a question when he says the world. I think you'd have to elaborate a little bit on what you're saying, whether you're asking a question or making a statement there, Ron. Maybe elaborate on it now if you want, or we can chat about what you're wanting to say from that later on. There's certainly a big difference between what Revelation is saying about the world outside of the church and the church itself that's being persecuted by the world, and we're going to see that made explicit in future chapters that we're going to read tonight. The world brings disasters. Indeed it does. Let's look, shall we, at a couple of other characters tonight. I want us to look first of all now at chapter 13 and a beast from the sea. Okay, this is chapter 13, and I'm beginning at verse 1 with this one. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. Okay. It's an interesting beast that emerges from the sea here. Let's have a think about what is being represented here. So the first thing to note is that the sea represents chaos, which is why in Revelation 21, which we'll get to in 2 weeks' time, we'll read that there will be no sea in the future. And we can talk about what that all means for people who like to swim in the sea and surf in a couple of weeks' time. The beast that emerges from this sea that symbolises chaos represents the political or authoritarian regimes that come out of chaos in our world. The whole earth will worship this beast in verse 8 because we all need political structures, or at least we think we do. But many political structures throughout history have put themselves in God's rightful place and blasphemed God. People throughout history have attempted to identify exactly who this beast is, what regime it is referring to. We're just going to think about that for a moment. You see, this beast has 7 heads. And in chapter 17, we're going to be told that those heads are 7 hills. So this must be Rome, right? The city built on 7 hills. Probably. But the only problem with that is that Sheffield was built on 7 hills too. So was the city of Bath, for that matter, and plenty of other places. What I'm trying to say here is that this is supposed to represent Rome to the early original readers of Revelation, but the evil of a blasphemous, murderous regime didn't end with Rome. We've seen it worldwide, and we miss the point if we try to narrow it down to one thing. But people love to try to do so anyway. Around the time of the Brexit vote, people were spouting prophecies about how the EU was the beast. Others throughout history have claimed it's the Pope, or communism, or fascism, or other religions. But this is all futile. This beast has many heads, and we should have worked out by now that this is a cyclical vision. It keeps repeating itself throughout history rather than being an isolated story. Verse 2 of chapter 13 describes that the beast is like a leopard, a lion, and a bear. And in Daniel 7 in the Old Testament, we get a description of a beast like a leopard, a lion, and a bear. And we are told there that they represented successive empires. Verse 3 tells us that this beast had a fatal wound. This is really interesting. It's a fatal wound that had healed. Just when you think you've got rid of one tyrant, another one emerges. Just as an example, think of Russia. There were the Tsars, and then when they exited the scene, there was then Lenin. And then when Russia got rid of Lenin eventually, there was then, or when he died, when there was then Stalin. Getting rid of one tyrant doesn't mean that another one is going to pop up. As Ron says, this could refer to lots of corrupt institutions. There's always another one popping up somewhere in the world. Also, this beast is popular with voters for some reason. People are perfectly capable of electing the beast to power. Think about some US elections you may recall. Okay, maybe think more helpfully, like about Hitler. You know, how people came to his assistance and propped him up and got him into a position of power. People legitimize the rule of terrible people. But let's be clear before we move on. This beast doesn't stand for all politics. The beastly rule is describing a totalitarian, corrupt one. Many governments are bad, but they're not evil. They're bad, but they still are accountable to some higher power, be that God or a constitution or whatever. But in truly evil administrations, the state is God and above all morals. Just going to pause whilst you think about that. Think about what questions or what discussions you might be coming to your mind as you think about corrupt institutions, as you think about political regimes and what this might be saying to us. That's the beast from the sea. Just as terrifying as that, we now have the beast from the earth. This is chapter 13 from verse 11. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast. It was deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honour of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands and on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. Okay, this is fascinating stuff, this beast. And there's been loads of speculation, loads of conspiracy theories over what's going on here. Let's take a look at it. We've already said that the dragon represents Satan, the personification of evil. The beast from the sea is evil regimes. What does this beast from the earth symbolize or represent? Well, chapter 13 tells us it looks like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. The Lamb of God and the dragon of evil. This is the false prophet that props up the false prophet of religion, or the false religion, if you like, that props up the political regime of the first beast. I'm not talking about Islam or any other real religions. Instead, there are 2 main theories for what is being worshipped here, and both are legitimate options, by the way. Many say it's the dictator that leads the evil regime that we've been speaking about with that first beast. And I could talk about that, but instead I'm going to argue tonight that this beast symbolises the worship of money. Whether through capitalism or communism or whatever financial system props up that evil regime. It's a bigger problem than you might think. Verse 16 says, whether big or small, rich or poor, we are all marked as people who love money and are slaves to the system. This might seem daft and a trivial matter. It might seem like the financial system we've got is just the best we can come up with, and the people who rebel against the system are the real problem. But stand back and remember for a moment that there's no monetary system at all in heaven. God simply operates by the economics of grace. I'm saying that I would like us to think about this beast as being the worship of money. But that's not interesting enough for some people. The number of the beast is 666, and people throughout history have often assumed that this means it's a person. And they may be right. You see, Hebrew and Greek letters have a number ascribed to them. For instance, there was some graffiti in Pompeii which said, "I love her whose name is 545. It's romantic graffiti if you're kind of a maths nerd, I guess. A big theory is that 666 is the numerical value in this system that corresponds to the name Nero, the Roman emperor, not the cafe. But that only works if you translate his name into Hebrew and make a spelling mistake. Hebrew was the language of the Old Testament, not the New Testament, so it's a bit of a leap to make. What seems more likely is to remember what number would signify perfection. We've said numerous times throughout this course that the number 7 symbolises perfection in the book of Revelation. So surely if we're going for a 3-digit number, we'd go for 777 to symbolise perfection. And interestingly as well, in this nerdy numerical game, Jesus' name comes out as 888, something even more than perfection. So surely 666 just refers to something less than perfection, a human number, something man-made, not a God, not perfect. So what do we do with this? What do we do about this when we live in an economically driven world? Well, we need to stand up and we need to kneel down. I'm not calling for anarchy, of course, but do stand up against economic injustices and oppression. And do kneel down and worship. There is something genuinely subversive in every culture about saying Jesus is Lord and the only one I worship. Not a human leader like Nero, and not the money that props them up, but truly worshipping one who's worthy of worship. Just want to take a moment just to see whether anybody wants to share anything in the comments at the moment, or whether anybody has any questions about what's been said there. As I've said, you don't have to. You can bring them to the Zoom discussion if you want, but I just want to give you an opportunity if you want to use the comment section at the moment. Whilst you're maybe typing or maybe not, I'm just going to set up the next section that we're going to look at. We've looked at some real bad characters, and now we're going to look at some good characters that we read about in chapter 14. This is chapter 14, verse 1. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him the 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. A second angel followed and said, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. The third angel said in a loud voice, If anyone worships the beast, They too will drink the wine of God's fury, which had been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel, still another angel, called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia. Apologies that I jumped around a little bit and had to truncate that passage there just for reasons of time. And there's a whole lot that we could discuss from there. If there's stuff that I haven't discussed tonight that you've read from these chapters and you want to ask questions or discuss them, then please do so. Join me on Zoom in a few moments' time and we'll do that. But I'm just going to look at some of the good characters that we've seen here, because although we've got some really good, nice characters here, some angels, Jesus, and the 144,000 who symbolise good people who followed Christ, the imagery is all really rather difficult to look at. We've got 144,000 people, and they've all been described in a poetic manner as blameless because of the Lamb. Again, there's some interesting and quite difficult language that's used to describe them when you read that passage in full. Maybe we can discuss that if you want, as I said, in a moment's time. But all you need to know is these 144,000 people are blameless because of Christ, because of what he did when he was sacrificed lamb-like. We also then get the Son of Man. Jesus appears on a cloud with a sickle. And there are 6 angels who all seem to encourage the reaping with this sickle. It is harvest time. Jesus has come to separate, to reap the harvest. But this is going to be a nasty, bloody affair, not the pleasant harvest scene we might like. Grapes will be gathered in this harvest and trampled, and blood will flow high. This is really shocking. This is offensive stuff. This is difficult to read because this is Jesus. Love personified. Jesus here is acting in anger. But maybe that's not shocking to the original audience, even if it's shocking to us. You see, the original audience were persecuted, but many others throughout history have known persecution and violence and murder, just like that original audience. So I just want to close tonight by actually sharing a conversation I had this week, a rather unexpected conversation that I had with my sister last week about Revelation. It came about because we were discussing a singer who we both absolutely love, Nina Simone. My sister spoke about the anger in that black soul singer, and I mentioned a song. I can't really mention it here because some of you may well be offended by the title, but it's 2 words, and the first word is Mississippi. If you really want, go and Google what the second one is. But the performance of that song is a spellbinding display of controlled anger at the lynching, at the mass people going out onto the street and executing black men in Mississippi in the 60s, and at the bombing of a church in Alabama too, which killed 4 black children. Nina Simone responded with controlled anger at that injustice and murder. And in my conversation with my sister, I was talking about how this really resonates with the book of Revelation, which is also written to people persecuted, just like the African American community. Jesus, love personified, responded with righteous anger in the temple during his human life before the ascension. And now he's back and he's acting decisively with controlled, righteous anger to end injustice and persecution forever. Next week, we're going to see Jesus in action as he rides out into battle. If you can, read chapters 17 to 19 ahead of next week. Don't worry if you can't, we'll cover it again as we always do. But I'd love it if you could take a look at it, and if you could join us next Thursday as we look at this idea of Jesus, the personification of love, having to act in judgment for justice. But for tonight, I think we've got quite a bit of interesting stuff to discuss over on Zoom right now. Do join us there if you can. I'd be fascinated to hear your take and your questions that you might have had from these chapters. If you can't join us, then do have a good rest of your evening, and we'll see you next week. Good night.